fellow alchemists, and welcome to Wordplay Wizardry. Last time we discussed book classifications by word count. In case you missed it, there's a link in the description. Today, I want to discuss perhaps the biggest element in fiction writing, and that is character creation. You may ask, well, why is character creation so important? Well, how much of a story would we have without people? It wouldn't so much be a story as it would be a collection of descriptions. Of course, if you like nature and architecture, that might be right up your alley. But that's not really fiction, now is it? A good way to look at character creation is something you might call the Sergio Leone method. And that involves the good, the bad, and the ugly. So let's start at the top. All stories center around a primary character, or main character, sometimes abbreviated as MC. If it's an ensemble story, it will be a group of main characters. What is an ensemble? According to Merriam-Webster, the word is borrowed from French and means unity or cohesion. Though, like a number of words, ensemble can go back even further to Latin, where we find ensemble, which means company or together. A general definition of ensemble is a group producing a single effect. So, an ensemble cast produces a single entity, each one functioning as a different aspect. That's why in sitcoms you have the funny one, the serious one, the awkward one, the smart one, the average one, the smooth one, the wild one. They may have individual moments, but in a group, they function as the singular individual. I guess you would say, official title for main character is protagonist. This comes from the ancient Greek word protagonistas, which means competitor at games or actor. Whether it's a singular main character or ensemble, the protagonist is who your story follows. This is where the bulk of your creation time will go. However, you'll also have secondary characters who have less page time but require more creation effort than background characters. Let me give you an example. In the Star Runner series, the main character is Simon Rigel. The crew and vast majority of officials that we meet are secondary characters. They're not exactly less important, but they're not the focus. Simon is. For the most part, everyone not named can fall into the background character category. A lot of these will be on the more basic side. Secondary characters get a similar creation treatment as the main character, just not as extensive. We don't need to know everything, or rather you, the author, doesn't need to know everything. Just enough solid traits to make them well-rounded. No cookie cutter or two-dimensional characters, please. And when I say two-dimensional, I mean flat, basic. These are defined by a single trait, oftentimes even stereotypical. No depth whatsoever. That's fine for a background character, but not a secondary or a main. But let's start building. First things first, what they look like. One thing I want to mention right off the bat is a creation theory for main characters, and that is MPD, minimal physical description. For several of my books, I use this. MPD means less physical description and more emphasis on personality traits. And right off, you may be asking, if we're starting with looks, why are we talking about less description? Because beyond some general guidelines, MPD allows your main character to be more accessible. If you give an absolute bare bones description, short hair, glasses, winning smile, the character is more relatable to people. Readers like to picture themselves in a story. And one way to accomplish this is to put them in the shoes of the main character. Now, if I were to say, white male with short hair, trimmed but slightly wild facial hair, blue eyes, heavy brow, and a strong jaw, you'd instantly get a picture in your mind. If I say a male with short hair, trimmed facial hair, and a strong jaw, that picture becomes more ambiguous, meaning the reader unconsciously assigns their own features to that character, so long as the reader of that example is male. But in both cases, I did start with gender, and you would be wise to do the same. It could be male, female, trans, fluid, or neutral, but gender is a good place to start. It will influence their look, feel, clothing, and reactions from other characters. If you don't want to use the minimal description method, next up is overall physical attributes: hair color, hair length, eye color and shape, nose, skin tone, height, and weight, just to name a few of the elements. For some of them, like height and weight, you can get a little more general. So instead of saying 6 feet tall and 250 pounds, you could say something like slightly taller than average and a little heavy for their frame. The second one would probably be more of an in-story description, just to give people an idea, but it does give an overall sense of their stature. If you wanted to go with the minimal description theory, you'd leave out things like skin color and eye color. Traits like long nose, thin lips, bright eyes can belong to characters of any race. Though, when describing a character, it might be a good idea to understand a little bit about genetic statistics. For instance, what percentage of people with African heritage have hazel eyes, or those of Asian descent? What about with blue eyes? How many actual eye colors are there? What are some of the names for the various skin tones? One thing to bring up, though, is a lot of this can change, at least early on here in the creation process. Maybe you start with a male character, but realize that a female protagonist would be much more interesting in your story. Maybe you start with somebody who's tall and strong, but realize that someone of a smaller stature would fit better. And it's worth mentioning that the biggest things that change are usually size. We know that men are typically taller and heavier than women. Other physical attributes can stay the same, unless you're taking a radical stance, such as white male with blue eyes changing to Latina woman with brown eyes. So long as you're not too deep into the writing process, when you realize that you need to make a change, you should be fine. Most of this is still in the planning phase and shouldn't affect too much. Either way, the thing that needs to remain solid is the character's personality. One thing you can do when first starting out is to go online and look up character personality sheet or template. Doing so will give you a list of prompts in order to fill in your character's backstory. Things like socioeconomic status, job, educational background. Now, I myself find a lot of those questionnaires to be a bit stiff, and I've never really liked filling them out. It feels somewhat artificial, though the information they provide is oftentimes beneficial. Let's look at another example. Antiquity. The main character there, Jasper Vaughn, works as an archaeological consultant. He goes to dig sites to determine their cultural significance, and occasionally does some digging and exploring of his own, such as diving a cenote in Mexico looking for hidden passages. That basic description of his job is fine, but how did he get that job? Those skills? To find out, we have to go into his background. Now, we find out that he used to be in the military, essentially doing the same job. He was in a CPP unit, or Cultural Property Protection Unit, protecting digs and finds from vandals. With that, we get the past influencing the present. Being former military means he still has some tics from that previous lifestyle invading his current life. Schedule, packing, terminology. Many of the vets I know still have an idiosyncrasy left over from their days in service. Is that all who they are? No. But serving did have a lasting effect. And to all the vets out there, thank you for your service. Another fact about Jasper is the reason he is no longer in a CPP unit. He was wounded while on duty, lost a leg to a grenade. This led to an honorable medical discharge from service. Technically, this would be termed a general or medical discharge under honorable circumstances. But having enjoyed his time in said unit, he made it his civilian career path, and those do exist. And for someone with a top-tier skill set, like one would get in such a unit, he can lead a pretty comfortable life. Starting to get an image of Jasper in your mind, at least who he is internally, that's the goal. Just like real life, a character's past influences their personality and their present. Every choice leads to a result. And if you create enough past choices, you get a well-rounded character. Now, if you're using an ensemble, you need to do this process for everyone in the party. The difference here is there can be slightly less involvement than with a singular main character. Each of the ensemble characters becomes more like a secondary character than a main. If there is a lead to the group, they can have a slightly more detailed backstory than the others, but it doesn't have to be by much. Remember, ensemble is parts becoming a whole. Each of the characters may or will have a different background, but they come together to work as one. I will say, if you haven't created a character before, it may be best to start with a personality sheet. Do a couple just so you understand the process. They make you think about the person you're creating. You don't have to use these, but filling them out can be practice. And if they are practice, doing so will give you an idea of what information to include and what can be left out when it comes to creating a real sheet. Let's move on to the secondary characters. For these, you're going to be doing a lot of the same work you did for your main character. They get all the description work that a primary gets, but the difference will come the personality traits. With secondary characters, you define a few less, and in this way, they begin blending in with background characters. Imagine a bullseye. At the center is your main character. They have the most page time, so they get the most focus. At the next ring out is your main secondary characters. They have the second most page time, which means they get quite a bit of focus, but not as many finer details as the main. The next ring is standard secondary characters. They have even less page time, so you can leave out even more details. Next is background secondary characters. These are named characters, but play very minor roles. The reader needs to understand them, but not much more. With these, you get basic history and basic personality traits. Now it's at this point that we start getting into acceptable two-dimensional characters. Something like a gruff, angry soldier. We don't need more than that because we won't be seeing them very often. When writing, you don't need a lot of depth for the day players. Characters in a scene or a moment or just for a chapter. They don't need your focus. The last ring is your background characters. They may have names, they may not, and they are exactly as the name implies, in the background. These characters will likely not speak, and if they do, it will be minimal. They need the least amount of work description and absolute minimal history. Nothing substantial at all. Honestly, I've seen furniture get more description than some background characters. A lot of times, they're just there to fill out the world, to be bodies and make it seem alive. There's more to cover, but let's leave it here for now. As always, if there's something you want me to cover in greater detail, leave a comment below. Be sure to like and subscribe, and if you're enjoying, leave a comment. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, fellow alchemists, take care.